The Dawn of Innovation, The First American Industrial Revolution, by Charles R. Morris. Narrated by David Colacci. Copyright 2012 by Charles R. Morris. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Public Affairs, a member of Perseus Books Group, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Publisher's Note: this audiobook is packaged with bonus material, which has been included on the first audio and MP3 CD. If you downloaded this audiobook in a digital format, please visit our website at www.tantor.com and type The Dawn of Innovation into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then click on PDF Extra 1. When prompted, enter the access code Technology to access the bonus material. Introduction. 3 stupendous and strongly reinforcing innovations in politics, in the economy, and in social relations took place in the United States in the 1820s and 1830s. Universal white male suffrage came into effect throughout the country, with voter turnouts routinely in the 80% range and a wide range of offices subject to the ballot. The American penchant for mechanized, large-scale production spread throughout industry, presaging the world's first mass-consumption economy. Finally, political and economic power shifted decisively away from society's traditional elites as the world's first true middle class seized control of the political apparatus. The archetypal American was almost a new species, literate and numerate, shrewd and confident, an unvarnished striver, swimming through a delightful chaos where money and opportunity were for the grasping on every side. As the United States became the world's dominant power in the 20th century, that model of society, albeit much adapted and trammeled, became the norm in advanced countries. The political and cultural threads of this story have been unraveled many times, most recently in Gordon Wood's splendid Empire of Liberty. I will concentrate on the nitty-gritty of the economic transformation, the details of the machinery, the technologies, and the new processes and work organizations that underlay America's stunning record of growth. But the evolution of the country's politics and class relations was an essential backdrop for its economic success, so I try to keep those developments in sight at every point. Some years ago I wrote a book called The Tycoons, which told the story of how the United States, within just the 3 decades or so after the Civil War, blew past Great Britain and became the #1 economic power in the world. I was drawn to that era because of the outsized characters, the John Rockefellers, the Andrew Carnegies, the Jay Goulds, the J.P. Morgans, who helped channel and shape the development of the new behemoth rising on the American continent. But the tycoons were not starting from scratch. If they had never lived, the course of American industrialization would certainly have been different. But the long American boom would have happened anyway and on roughly the same scale. The country was just too productive, too entrepreneurial, too inventive, too original, not to have burst into the front rank of world powers, almost regardless of its leadership. The Dawn of Innovation, therefore, takes the story back to the beginning of the century, when the country started building the economic platform that launched the astonishing industrial development in the decades after the Civil War. I use 2 main thematic hooks to organize the story. First, I frame it as an implicit competition between America and Great Britain. That is the way most Americans viewed it after the old Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, passed from the scene. After the Revolution, British opinion still treated the United States as a pseudo-colony, and the War of 1812 had Americans once again fighting British troops on American soil. As French and Spanish power faded, only the British stood in the way of American continental ambitions, and it was no secret that British sympathies were with the disunionists during the Civil War. Even Hamilton, a great admirer of the British system, mused that the United States might well be its equal within 40 or 50 years, which wasn't far off the mark. The second theme is to argue for a broader definition of what came to be called the American system of manufacturing. That was the name the British applied to the American machinery-intensive methods of manufacturing guns. Armory practice is a more appropriate designation, for while it is an important thread of American development, culminating in the great 20th century automobile plants, during most of the 19th century it applied only to a narrow range of industrial output. There was indeed a distinctly American approach to manufacturing in the 19th century. It was the drive to mass production and mass distribution in every field, from foodstuffs to soap and candles, axes and locomotives, horseshoes, wooden doors, carriage wheels, bedroom furniture, and almost anything else. The nature of the machinery and the underlying technologies varied from product to product. Soap making was different from steel making, and neither had much in common with making guns or clocks. And sometimes American mass production was all about organization, not machinery, as in the antebellum shoe industry. It was the uniquely American penchant for scale and speed that ultimately created the mass consumption economy. Mass consumption, the rise of a successful middle class, and a democratized government were all part of the package that was the great American experiment. The plan of the book. I open with a little-known tale from the War of 1812, the Shipbuilders' War on Lake Ontario. Both sides understood that controlling the lake was key to winning the war, and asymmetries in the two sides' armaments and tactics led to a classic arms race. Absurdly, by war's end the lake was home to some of the largest and most formidably armed warships in the world. Both sides' supply systems were pushed to the point of exhaustion, but the effort played a big role in jump-starting American industrialization. The next chapter focuses on Great Britain, the 19th century's hyperpower. Its technical and scientific breakthroughs were the critical substrate for American progress. The British also invented mass production in their great textile industries, but were amazed to discover in mid-century that the Americans were applying the same concepts across almost the whole of industry. The story of American development can be charted as an evolution from local to regional and finally to national networks. Strong regional economies emerged in the Northeast in the first quarter of the century. By the 1820s, rural New England and the Middle Atlantic region were hotbeds of industrialization, with farms and forges working cheek by jowl, and the self-subsistent farm family already an anachronism. Industries like clocks, cloth, shoes, and cast-iron stoves were achieving seaboard-wide markets. I also devote a full chapter to the development of the armory practice of the Connecticut River Valley and the great inventors who pioneered precision machine manufacturing. Important names in the immediate post-war period are Eli Terry and Chauncey Jerome, the Hollies, Oliver Evans, Francis Cabot Lowell, and Paul Moody, Thomas Blanchard, and John Hall. In the 1820s and 1830s, the West signified the area bounded by the western slopes of the Appalachians and the eastern shores of the Mississippi. Since interior transportation was virtually nil, there evolved a pellet economy of little self-sufficient towns clustered on riverbanks. The breakthrough was the development of the Western steamboat by Henry Shreve and Daniel French. It was a cunningly adapted craft that could carry massive loads on shallow, swift water, blithely steaming upstream against rapids. Within a decade, the region's great grain, lumber, and meat animal enterprises were centralizing in Cincinnati, as a tight-knit riverine economy took shape within the Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi valleys. Cincinnati invented the meat-packing disassembly line, later made famous by Chicago, and Cincinnati brothers-in-law Procter and Gamble were innovators in America's first chemical industry. Cincinnati and the West were also a prime subject for the finest American travel writers from this period: Alexis de Tocqueville, Francis Trollope, Harriet Martineau, Charles Dickens, and Lucy Bird. The United States emerged as a world economic powerhouse in the 1840s and 1850s, when the railroads finally linked the Northeast and the Midwest, as it was now called, into an integrated commercial and industrial unit. The heavy industry of the Midwest flowed from its resource endowment: coal and iron, food processing, a mechanized lumber industry, as well as derivatives from steamboat building, like engines, furniture, and glass. In the Northeast, its traditional industries like clocks, textiles, and shoes grew to global scale, along with big-ticket fabrication businesses like Baldwin locomotives, Collins steamships, Hoe printing presses, and the giant Corliss engines. The South, in the meantime, slipped into the position of an internal colony, exploiting its slaves and being exploited in turn by the Northeast and Midwest. Boston and New York controlled much of the shipping, insurance, and brokerage earnings from the cotton trade, while the earnings left over went for Midwestern food, tools, and engines shipped down the Mississippi and its branches. The British, who were habitually dismissive of Brother Jonathan, their bumpkin transatlantic cousin, discovered American manufacturing prowess at London's Great Crystal Palace Exhibition in 1851. They particularly focused on the machine-made guns of Sam Colt and the Vermont manufacturer Robbins and Lawrence. Colt's newest factories in both London and Hartford were the most advanced precision manufacturing plants in the world at the time. The British created a new armory plant at Enfield, equipped entirely with American machinery. The plant was a great success, but with no impact in the wider economy. Few Britons even noticed, as one sharp-eyed civil servant put it, that in the United States almost all industries were carried on in the same way as the cotton manufacture of England, viz., in large factories, with machinery applied to every process, the extreme subdivision of labor, and all reduced to an almost perfect system of manufacture. Destructive though it was, the Civil War broke the slaveocracy's power to obstruct an American development agenda. In one of the darkest years of the war, the Republican Congress passed the Homestead Act, the Land-Grant College Act. No other country had conceived the possibility of educating its farmers and craftsmen, and the Transcontinental Railroad Act. The rise of a new world economic hyperpower was virtually assured. The book closes with both epilogue and prologue. Chapter 8 is a compressed account of how America caught up to and finally surpassed Great Britain in the decades after the Civil War. That story highlights the great advantages possessed by a fast-growing, emerging power moving to supplant an older incumbent. To round out the story, therefore, the book closes with an assessment of the new contest between an aging economic incumbent, now the United States, and China, the fast-surging potential usurper, and looks particularly at what is likely to be similar to and quite different from the story that began to unfold some 2 centuries ago. Chapter 1. The Shipbuilders' War. The War of 1812 may be the least remembered of American wars, and buried in the historical fog is the strange tale of a naval arms race on Lake Ontario. Ontario is the smallest of the Great Lakes and virtually landlocked. Yet in the early winter of 1815, 20 formidable warships were scheduled to take to the water at the spring thaw. 4 of them would be first-raters, 2 of them American, 2 of them British, each of them ranking among the largest and most heavily armed warships in the world. Great Britain was the world's greatest ever naval power. Of the 600 or so war vessels in the Admiralty's active fleet, About 110 were ships of the line, all big, powerful vessels designed to overawe and overwhelm the enemy. Of the in-service ships of the line, however, only 6 were first-raters. They were one of the age's most complex machines, the behemoths of the ocean, 200 feet long, displacing 2,500 tons, topmasts soaring 200 feet above the waterline, carrying crews of 800 seamen and marines, and disposing of at least 100 heavy guns in 3 tiers along their sides. Building a first-rater consumed 4,000 large trees, hundreds of tons of iron for fittings, cannon, and ballast, miles of rigging, an acre and a half of sail, some 1,400 ship pulley blocks, some of them almost as tall as a man. Nelson at Trafalgar led the charge against the Napoleonic Armada in his first-rater HMS Victory. During the first year of the war, it became clear to both sides that winning control of Lake Ontario was the key to winning the war, and both poured money and resources into the effort. Both sides expected that an early naval battle would decide the issue, but inherent asymmetries in armaments and naval tactics trapped them both within the grim logic of an escalating arms race. To the surprise of both participants, the Americans doggedly matched and raised the British step by step until both were at the point of exhaustion. A War of Honor. The American declaration of war against Great Britain in June 1812 is a puzzlement for historians. The death struggle between the British and Napoleonic France indiscriminately inflicted damage on neutral countries. If anything, the French were the more disdainful of Americans and worked the greater destruction on American shipping. As Henry Adams pointed out, every charge in President Madison's war declaration was both factually correct and a sufficient cause for war. But the United States had patiently endured such behavior for 5 years, so why declare war in 1812, when the American government was close to insolvency and Great Britain was on the brink of making major trade concessions? British and Canadian historians tend to see the war as an unsuccessful American war of conquest. Congressional war hawks, in fact, made no secret of their desire to annex part of Canada, but they did not come close to commanding a legislative majority. Public outrage was more focused on the British impressment of American merchant seamen. In principle, the British had a right to take their own nationals, but naval captains were not overly scrupulous about trapping bona fide American citizens in their trawls. The Royal Navy was their Maginot Line against Napoleon, and years of warfare had created a terrible shortage of seamen. Even American officials privately acknowledged that up to a quarter of U.S. merchant seamen were deserted British nationals, and citizenship papers for British seamen were sold openly in most American ports. Behind the headline issues, the old characterization of the war as the Second War for American Independence has considerable truth. The British still reflexively treated America as a component of its colonial mercantile empire, high-handedly issuing detailed trade licenses while refusing a generalized trade treaty. Royal Navy captains felt free to sail into American ports and haughtily, and occasionally forcefully, sequester scarce provisions. The London Times sneered in 1807 that Americans could not cross to Staten Island without the Royal Navy's permission. But national pride couldn't dispel the reality that the United States was in no shape to fight a war. Years of British and French blockades had devastated customs revenues. Its navy consisted of some coastal gunboats and a handful of frigates, all built in the 1790s. The army was small and scattered through frontier outposts, so the primary ground forces were state militias, which were inconsistently trained and armed, if at all, and often prevented by law from serving outside their home states. Governors in several Federalist states, moreover, announced that they would not release their militias for federal service on constitutional grounds. Few senior officials had significant recent military experience. The war proceeded on several loosely connected fronts. In the first year of the war, the most spectacular encounters were a series of frigate-to-frigate ocean battles. The Constitution's half-hour destruction of the British Guerriere prompted unrestrained celebration in America and shocked laments in London. The Royal Navy finally put an end to such impertinences by imposing a suffocating blockade up and down the coast that kept the frigates almost entirely port-bound for the duration of the war. With the blockade in place, sea action shifted to an intense informal war between the Royal Navy and American privateers, especially the famous Chesapeake schooners, or Baltimore clippers. They were the leopards of the sea, up to 100 feet long, mounting up to 18 guns, with vast expanses of sail, deep keels for rapid maneuverability, and superb hydrodynamics. They consistently outsailed and outwitted British warships, and by the later stages of the war, even prowled in the Thames. In addition, throughout the war years, Andrew Jackson led a sporadic Indian war in the southeast, an early salvo in a 2-decade-long ethnic cleansing operation. He and other local commanders raised and equipped their troops and operated more or less independently of Washington. The most important fighting, however, whether measured by casualties, commitment of resources, or persistence, was centered on the lakes, especially Ontario and Erie, reinforcing the contention that the war was about Canada, for whoever controlled the lakes would inevitably control Canada. The Lake Arena. Early Stumbles. The British had only the lightest of colonial presences in Canada. There was a world-class Royal Navy port at Halifax, Nova Scotia, and just to the west the territory of Lower Canada, predominantly French, included substantial commercial centres at Quebec and Montreal. Upper Canada stretched along the lake shores. It was primitive and Anglophone, probably mostly settled by Americans who had straggled across the border. Both Upper and Lower Canada were under the direction of Governor-General George Prevost, an experienced British general officer based in Quebec. The only practical access to Upper Canada was via the St. Lawrence. The river was navigable by ship as far as Montreal. From there, the 150-mile stretch to Lake Ontario was dominated by rapids and shallows traversed by towed bateaux and barges. The territory was barely self-sufficient in food, with few roads and little in the way of industry, so a defense force would be completely dependent on river-borne supplies. Losing control of the St. Lawrence or of Lake Ontario virtually guaranteed the loss of Upper Canada and could put much of Lower Canada at risk. The demographics of the lakes clearly favored the Americans, whose lake shores were more populous, with better internal transportation, highly productive farmland, and budding iron industries that could support the war effort. But the British compensated by fashioning broad alliances with Indian tribes seeking to stop American settlement. Western settlers were in terror of the Indians, especially after the success of the great Indian leader Tecumseh in cobbling together a serious Indian confederacy. The battle with Tecumseh's forces at Tippecanoe in November 1811 was officially celebrated as an American triumph, but cognoscenti knew it was a close-run thing, with Americans taking the heavier casualties. Even militias panicked and ran from Indian detachments in the early stages of the war. The Americans took the early military initiatives in the summer of 1812, almost all on the ground, producing pratfalling Marx Brothers-class fiascos, too costly and bloody to be comic. General William Hull made a timorous thrust up the Detroit River and surrendered to a much smaller force at almost the first shots, giving up his army, Fort Detroit, a warship, and the entire Michigan Territory. Henry Dearborn, another aging Revolutionary War general, launched a large, lethargic, but complex nighttime attack in the Niagara Peninsula. Amid indiscipline and chaos, his ill-prepared troops took very heavy casualties. Dearborn later tried a second action directed at Montreal, but retired to winter quarters after a brief skirmish near Plattsburgh. A wag called it a failure without even the heroism of a disaster. If nothing else, the early failures demonstrated that naval control of the lakes was crucial for effective movement of troops and supplies. The Americans were the first to respond, naming Isaac Chauncey to a new post of naval commander of the lakes. Chauncey was an experienced, active officer, and fortuitously had most recently been commander of the New York Navy Yard. It took until the following spring for London to realize that Chauncey's vigor was putting Canada at risk. They responded in March 1813 by appointing Sir James Lucas Yeo to lead a naval expeditionary force to the lakes. Only 30 years old, Yeo was already a post captain, with a long record as a fighting officer, and possessed by the same drive and force of personality as Chauncey. When Yeo arrived at Lake Ontario in May 1813, the shipbuilders' war was on. Industrial War in the Wilderness. The shipbuilders' war lasted for 2.5 years. Both sides constructed substantial cities at their primary bases near the mouth of the St. Lawrence. The British base at Kingston, on the north shore, was a 30-mile sail from the American base on the opposite shore, at Sackett's Harbor. By war's end, each was able to house and feed some 5,000 semi-permanent residents, seamen, marines, and their officers, shipwrights, smiths, and other craftsmen, plus massive ship factories and associated shops, as well as facilities for short-term feeding and support of the thousands of infantrymen mustered from time to time for amphibious operations. It was easy to underestimate the challenges of the lakes. On maps they looked like mere puddles. But winds were highly variable, and violent storms sprang up almost without warning. Shallow waters often generate the most violent storms. Ocean depths absorb the force of surface disturbances. The lake's heavy fogs and frequent squalls, and the near-constant presence of a lee shore, jangled captains' nerves. On Lake Huron, an American captain found himself embayed in a gale of wind on a rocky, iron-bound shore, shipping such immense quantities of water as to give me very serious alarm for some hours. The whole coast, he said, was a steep perpendicular rock, and navigation extremely dangerous, falling suddenly from no soundings into 3 fathoms, 18 feet, and twice into 1/4 less than twain, 10.5 feet. The challenge was to build weatherly fighting ships fast and cheaply, cutting corners without compromising performance. Ships built of unseasoned wood go to rot within just a few years, so many finishing details could be dispensed with. With no need to carry water or long-term supplies, they had smaller holds and shallower drafts, enabling close approaches to shore. The American ships especially carried large expanses of sail and heavy gunnery for their size. For example, to the British, the American Pike was a difficult sailer, but in the hands of an expert crew it was among the quickest and most maneuverable warships on the lakes. Chauncey's orders were the kind commanders dream of. He was to obtain control of the lakes Ontario and Erie with the least possible delay. With respect to the means to be employed, you will consider yourself unrestrained and at liberty to purchase, hire, or build such vessels of such form and armament as he chose. His prize acquisition was Henry Eckford, one of the age's great naval architects, and owner of a private shipyard in New York. He turned out to be a master of improvisation, as in devising easier-to-build bracings for ships with short shelf lives. Old hands expected Eckford's ships to break in two when they were launched down the slipway, but all of them performed well. Backing up Eckford were the Brown brothers, Noah and Adam, who also operated a New York boatyard. The Browns designed and built the ships on Lakes Erie and Champlain, and worked so smoothly.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?